The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the worn mats of Phoenix Rising MMA gym, where the rhythmic thud of gloves against heavy bags created a symphony that Marcus Thompson had grown to love over his 15 years of training. The warehouse-turned-gym in the industrial district of Phoenix, Arizona, smelled of sweat and determination, its walls lined with faded photographs of local champions and motivational quotes that had long since yellowed with age. 23 fighters were scattered across the space that Tuesday afternoon, some sparring in the octagon-shaped ring at the center, others working the speed bags or grappling on the mats. The air-conditioning unit in the corner wheezed and rattled, fighting a losing battle against the desert heat that seeped through every crack in the building's aging frame. Marcus was in the middle of demonstrating a rear naked choke to 3 of his newer students when the front door swung open with such force that it banged against the wall, causing every head in the gym to turn. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the blinding Arizona sunlight, was a woman. She couldn't have been more than 35, though the deep lines of exhaustion etched across her face made her appear older. Her dark hair was pulled back in a hasty ponytail, strands escaping to frame hollow cheeks. She wore faded blue scrubs, the kind worn by hospital workers, and clutched a worn purse against her chest as if it were a shield. But it was her eyes that made Marcus release his grip on his training partner and rise to his feet. Those eyes held something he recognized from his own past, something he'd seen in the mirror during the darkest chapters of his life. Desperation. Pure, undiluted desperation, mixed with a determination that bordered on reckless. The woman stood there for a moment, her chest heaving as if she'd been running. The sounds of training gradually died down as more fighters noticed the intrusion, the heavy bags swinging to stillness, the grunts and calls fading into curious silence. She scanned the room, her gaze moving from face to face, taking in the muscled forms, the cauliflower ears, the scars and tattoos that told stories of battles won and lost. "I need you to stop," she said, her voice cracking on the last word. "Please, I need all of you to stop what you're doing and listen to me. If you're new to this channel, make sure to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Stories like this one remind us of the incredible power of community and compassion, and we have so many more to share with you." Coach Ray Delgado, who had owned Phoenix Rising for over 2 decades, stepped forward from his position near the water cooler. At 62, Ray had seen just about everything the fighting world could throw at a person. He'd trained champions and washouts, watched careers soar and crumble, witnessed the best and worst of human nature within these walls. But something about this woman, about the raw urgency in her voice, made him approach her with the same caution he'd use with a wounded animal. "Ma'am," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "this is a private gym. Whatever you're selling or collecting for, I'm sure we can—" "I'm not selling anything." She took a step forward, and Ray noticed she was trembling. Not from fear, he realized, but from exhaustion. This woman was running on fumes, pushing herself past limits that should have collapsed hours ago. "My name is Elena Vasquez. I'm a nurse at St. Mary's Medical Center, and I need your help." A few of the fighters exchanged glances. Danny Chen, a welterweight with 3 professional wins under his belt, let out a small snort. "Lady, I don't know what kind of help you think you're going to find in here, but we're kind of in the middle of—" "My son." Elena's voice cut through his dismissal like a blade. "My son is 12 years old. His name is Miguel, and 3 men have been following him home from school every day for the past 2 weeks." The atmosphere in the gym shifted immediately. Marcus, who had been watching the scene unfold from the edge of the mat, felt something cold settle in his stomach. The other fighters had stopped even pretending to continue their workouts. Jake Morrison, a heavyweight with hands the size of dinner plates, set down the jump rope he'd been using and crossed his arms over his massive chest. "Following him?" Ray asked, his expression darkening. What do you mean, following him? Elena's composure, which had been held together by sheer willpower, began to crack. Her lower lip trembled, and she pressed her hand against her mouth for a moment, fighting to maintain control. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. They wait for him outside Jefferson Middle School. Different cars, but the same men. They follow him to our apartment building, sometimes calling out to him, asking him questions. Yesterday, one of them got out of the car and tried to talk to him directly, told him he had a message for his mother. She paused, her eyes filling with tears she refused to let fall. Told him that his mother owed money to some very important people and that Miguel was going to help make sure she paid. Ray's jaw tightened. Have you called the police? I've called them 4 times. The bitterness in Elena's voice was palpable. They took a report. They said they'd increase patrols in the area. But nothing has changed. These men are still there, every single day. And the police told me that unless something actually happens, unless they actually hurt my son, there's nothing they can do. She laughed, but it was a hollow sound, devoid of any humor. They said I should consider moving. Moving? Danny Chen stepped forward, his earlier dismissiveness completely gone. Just like that? Pack up and move? I'm a single mother working double shifts just to keep a roof over our heads. I can't afford to move. I can barely afford the rent we're paying now. Elena's hands clenched into fists at her sides. And even if I could move, these men would find us. They found us before when we left California. They'll find us again. Marcus finally spoke, his deep voice cutting through the tension. Who do you owe money to? Elena turned to face him, and for a long moment she simply stared. Marcus knew what she was seeing. At 6'3", with broad shoulders and a face that bore the marks of countless fights, he wasn't exactly approachable. The scar that ran through his left eyebrow, the slightly crooked nose, the intense dark eyes that had been described by more than one opponent as unsettling. But Elena seemed to see past all of that to something beneath. My ex-husband, she finally said, Carlos. He was involved with some very dangerous people back in Los Angeles, loan sharks or something worse. I'm not even sure exactly what they do. When I was married to him, I signed some papers. I didn't know what they were at the time. He told me they were for our taxes. She shook her head, the motion filled with years of regret. It turns out I co-signed on a loan, a big one. When Carlos disappeared 2 years ago, the debt became mine. How much? Ray asked. $80,000. A low whistle came from somewhere in the back of the gym. Ray rubbed his hand over his grey stubble, processing this information. And you've been paying? Every month. Everything I can spare after rent and food and keeping the lights on. I've paid back almost $30,000 over 2 years. Eleanor's voice cracked again. But last month they said it wasn't enough. They said the interest had increased. They said I now owe $120,000, and if I don't start paying more, they'll have to find other ways to collect. Other ways, meaning your son, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. Elena nodded, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Miguel doesn't deserve this. He's a good kid. He gets good grades. He helps around the apartment. He's never been in trouble a day in his life. And now he's afraid to walk home from school. He barely sleeps. He wakes up screaming from nightmares. Her voice broke completely. He's 12 years old. He should be worrying about video games and homework, not whether today is the day those men finally do more than just follow him. The gym had fallen completely silent. Even the ancient air conditioning unit seemed to have stopped its rattling, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Marcus looked around at his fellow fighters, reading the expressions on their faces. Anger, concern, a protective instinct that transcended the competitive rivalries that usually defined their relationships. Jake Morrison was the first to move. The heavyweight walked across the gym with surprising grace for a man of his size, stopping directly in front of Eleanor. Up close, she seemed even smaller, her head barely reaching his shoulder. Jake looked down at her with an expression that was surprisingly gentle for a man who had knocked out 17 opponents in his professional career. "What time does your son get out of school?" he asked. Elena blinked, clearly not expecting the question. 3:15, but I don't understand. "What's the address?" "The school is at the corner of Van Buren and 42nd, she said slowly. "Our apartment is about a mile and a half east, on Garfield." Jake turned to look at the other fighters. "Who's free tomorrow afternoon?" Hands went up around the gym. Marcus counted them. 5, 10, 15. More hands kept rising. Danny Chen, the Martinez brothers who trained together every day. Lisa Park, one of the few female fighters who trained at Phoenix Rising, raised her hand with a fierce determination in her eyes. By the time the count was finished, 20 fighters had volunteered. Elena stared at the raised hands, her mouth opening and closing without words coming out. I can't pay you. I came here because I didn't know where else to go. I thought maybe you could teach me some self-defense, something I could teach Miguel." "We're not asking for payment," Ray said, stepping forward again. "That's not what this is about." "Then what?" Marcus walked toward her, and for the first time, his hard expression softened. "Mrs. Vasquez, every person in this gym has fought for something. That's what we do. We fight. But most of us got into this sport because at some point in our lives, we felt powerless. We felt like the world was too big and too dangerous, and we needed to find a way to stand up for ourselves." He gestured to the raised hands around him. "Now we have the skills to stand up for others too. Your son shouldn't have to be afraid. And those men who are following him need to understand that Miguel isn't alone." Elena's resolve finally crumbled. She covered her face with her hands as sobs racked her thin frame. Lisa Park was at her side in seconds, wrapping an arm around the older woman's shoulders and guiding her to a bench against the wall. Someone pressed a bottle of water into her hands. Someone else offered tissues. Ray gathered the volunteers around him, his voice low but commanding. "All right, listen up. This isn't a sanctioned fight. There are rules we need to follow if we're going to do this right. We're not looking for confrontation. We're not looking to start anything. Our job is to be visible. Our job is to make sure Miguel Vasquez walks home safely, and to make those men understand that if they want to get to this kid, they're going to have to go through all of us." "What if they don't back down?" Danny asked. "Then we deal with it," Jake replied. "But we don't throw the first punch. We don't give them any excuse to make us the bad guys. We protect the kid, we document everything we see, and we make it clear that this isn't going to be easy for them anymore." Marcus nodded in agreement. "We should coordinate with the police too. Let them know what we're doing. Make sure everything is above board." Ray pointed at Marcus. "That's your job. You've got connections with the community liaison officers. Get them involved, get them aware, and make sure we're not stepping on any toes." For the next hour, they planned. They learned Miguel's schedule, his route home, the makes and models of the cars that had been following him. Elena showed them photos on her phone of the men she'd seen, grainy images captured from her apartment window. Men with hard faces and cold eyes who looked exactly like the kind of people who would threaten a child to collect a debt. They exchanged phone numbers, created a group chat, and assigned shifts. The fighters who had day jobs would take the afternoon school runs. The ones with more flexible schedules would handle surveillance, keeping an eye out for suspicious activity throughout the day. Lisa, who had a background in social work before discovering her talent for mixed martial arts, volunteered to help Elena navigate the legal options for dealing with her debt situation. By the time Elena left the gym that evening, she was no longer alone, and as she walked to her car in the fading Arizona light, she turned back to look at the group of fighters standing in the doorway, watching her go. For the first time in months, something sparked in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Hope. The next afternoon, Miguel Vasquez walked out of Jefferson Middle School with his backpack slung over one shoulder and his eyes fixed on the ground. He was small for his age, with his mother's dark hair and a smattering of freckles across his nose that made him look even younger than 12. His shoulders were hunched, his steps quick and nervous, the posture of a boy who had learned to make himself as small and unnoticeable as possible. He'd already spotted the car, the black sedan with the tinted windows, parked across the street in the same spot it had occupied for the past 2 weeks. The engine was running, a thin trail of exhaust rising in the warm air. Miguel's heart hammered against his ribs as he forced himself to keep walking, to not run, because running only made them follow faster. But as he turned onto the sidewalk, something unusual caught his attention. A man was standing at the corner, leaning against a light pole with his arms crossed. He was large, probably the largest person Miguel had ever seen outside of a movie screen, with a bald head and arms covered in tattoos. The man wasn't looking at Miguel directly, but there was something about his posture that suggested he was very much aware of the boy's presence. Miguel's step faltered. Another one of them, he thought, his stomach dropping. They were closing in. But then he noticed something else. The big man was wearing a T-shirt that said Phoenix Rising MMA across the chest, and as Miguel watched, the man turned slightly and gave him a subtle nod, a gesture that was somehow both casual and reassuring. Confused, Miguel continued walking. He passed the man and continued down the street, acutely aware of the black sedan beginning to pull away from the curb to follow. But before it could move more than a few feet, another car pulled out from a side street and stopped directly in its path. Not aggressively, just a coincidence, a driver who needed to check their phone before turning into traffic. Miguel looked at the car that had blocked the sedan. Inside, he could see a young Asian man behind the wheel, wearing the same Phoenix Rising T-shirt as the giant at the corner. The man glanced at Miguel through the window and again gave that same subtle nod. His heart still racing, but now, for different reasons, Miguel continued his walk home, and as he turned onto Garfield Street, he realized that he hadn't walked alone. The big man from the corner had somehow materialized on the opposite side of the street, walking at the same pace, maintaining distance but clearly present. A woman jogged past on Miguel's side, earbuds in, completely absorbed in her workout, but Miguel caught a glimpse of the logo on her tank top. Phoenix Rising MMA. When Miguel finally reached his apartment building, he stopped and turned around. The black sedan was nowhere in sight. But standing at the end of the block was the big man, and now there were 2 others with him. They weren't approaching, weren't saying anything. They were just there, a wall of muscle and determination between Miguel and whatever threat might follow. One of them, a man with a scar through his eyebrow and intense dark eyes, raised his hand in a brief wave. Then they turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner, as if they'd never been there at all. Miguel stood frozen on the steps of his apartment building, his mind racing to process what had just happened. For the first time in 2 weeks, he hadn't felt afraid on his walk home. For the first time in 2 weeks, someone other than his mother had made him feel protected. He ran upstairs to find Elena already home, her face lined with anxiety. When she saw him burst through the door, her relief was immediate and overwhelming. She rushed to him, pulling him into a hug so tight it momentarily squeezed the air from his lungs. "How was it?" she asked, her voice muffled against his hair. "Did they—" "Mom." Miguel pulled back, his eyes wide with wonder. "There were people, big people. They were watching out for me." Elena nodded, tears threatening again. "I know, mijo, I know." "Who are they?" "Friends," she said simply. "People who wanted to help." Miguel was quiet for a moment, processing this information. Then slowly, a smile spread across his face. It was the first genuine smile Elena had seen from her son in weeks. "They looked like superheroes," he said. "Like the kind from the movies." Elena laughed, a real laugh that bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her, a place she'd thought had gone permanently dark. They're not superheroes, sweetheart. They're fighters, and they're going to make sure you're safe. Over the following days, the Phoenix Rising fighters fell into a routine. The escort shifts rotated smoothly, ensuring that Miguel was never alone during his walk home from school. The black sedan continued to appear, but it kept its distance now, observing from further away, as if assessing this new development. The men inside never approached, never called out. They just watched. But the fighters watched back. Marcus had made good on his promise to coordinate with local law enforcement. Officer Patricia Hendricks, the community liaison for the district, had been initially skeptical when he'd explained the situation. But after reviewing Elena's police reports and the information about the men following Miguel, she'd agreed to increase patrols in the area and to keep the Phoenix Rising operation informed of any developments. "This isn't typical," she told Marcus during one of their meetings at a coffee shop near the gym. "Vigilante stuff usually makes things worse, not better." "We're not vigilantes," Marcus had replied. "We're just people walking down a public street. It's not illegal to walk." Hendricks had smiled at that. "Just make sure it stays that way. The moment any of you lay a hand on anyone, this whole thing falls apart, and your friends end up in cells instead of that gym." Marcus had nodded seriously. "Understood. We're not looking for a fight. We're just trying to prevent one." By the end of the first week, something had shifted. The black sedan appeared less frequently. The men inside seemed less confident, their earlier boldness replaced by a cautious uncertainty. They hadn't expected this, Marcus realized. They'd expected an isolated single mother and a vulnerable child. They'd expected easy targets. What they'd found instead was something very different. Elena had noticed the change too. During her double shifts at the hospital, she no longer felt the gnawing terror that had become her constant companion. She knew that when she wasn't there, others were watching over her son. It was a strange feeling, trusting strangers with the most precious thing in her life. But these strangers had earned that trust, one safe walk home at a time. It was during the second week that things escalated. Miguel had just emerged from school, falling into the comfortable routine of looking for his escorts. He spotted Danny Chen waiting at the corner, pretending to read something on his phone. Lisa Park was visible at the next block, stretching as if preparing for a run. Jake Morrison was parked across the street in his truck, his massive frame barely fitting behind the wheel. Everything seemed normal until Miguel noticed that the black sedan wasn't in its usual spot. Instead, there was a different car, a silver SUV with dark windows, parked much closer to the school entrance. And standing beside it were 3 men. Miguel's stomach clenched with familiar fear. These weren't the same men who usually followed him. These were new faces, harder and more intimidating. One of them was enormous, nearly as big as Jake, with a shaved head and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. He was staring directly at Miguel. Danny noticed the change too. He put away his phone and began walking toward Miguel, his casual posture shifting into something more alert. Lisa had stopped her stretching routine and was watching the SUV with narrowed eyes. Jake was already out of his truck, moving with surprising speed for his size. The scarred man began walking toward Miguel. His companions followed, fanning out slightly to block any easy escape route. Miguel felt frozen, his feet rooted to the sidewalk as fear overwhelmed his young body. "Hey, kid," the scarred man called out. His voice was gravelly, like rocks grinding together. "Your mom around?" Before Miguel could respond, Danny appeared at his side. The welterweight fighter was half the size of the scarred man, but there was something in his stance, a coiled readiness that made his presence significant. "I think you've got the wrong kid," Danny said calmly. "He's with us." The scarred man's eyes flicked to Danny, then to Lisa and Jake, who were now flanking them. His expression shifted from predatory confidence to something more calculating. "This doesn't concern you," he said. "We just want to talk to the boy. Private business." "See, that's the thing about private business," Jake rumbled, his voice like thunder. "It stops being private when it involves harassing a kid outside his school. That's public, that's witnessed, that's documented." He held up his phone, clearly recording. "So why don't you boys get back in your shiny SUV and find somewhere else to be?" The scarred man's face contorted with anger. For a tense moment, Miguel thought he was going to attack. The man's hands clenched into fists, his body weight shifting forward in a way that Miguel recognized from watching his escorts train. It was the prelude to violence. But then the man looked around again, taking in the full picture. 3 fighters, obviously trained, obviously unafraid. Phones out, recording everything. Other students and parents beginning to gather, drawn by the obvious confrontation. School security guards moving toward them across the parking lot. The math didn't work. Whatever calculation he was running in his head, the answer was clear. "This isn't over," the scarred man said, his voice low enough that only Danny and Miguel could hear. "Tell Elena Vasquez that Mr. Reyes is getting impatient. Tell her that bodyguards can't be everywhere at once. Tell her that debts have a way of getting collected one way or another." Then he turned and walked back to the SUV. His companions followed. Moments later, the vehicle pulled away from the curb and disappeared into traffic. Miguel was shaking. Danny put a hand on his shoulder, grounding him. "You're okay," Danny said. "They're gone. You're safe." "They said—" "I know what they said. Don't worry about it. That's just talk." Danny guided Miguel toward Jake's truck. "Come on, let's get you home." But as they drove through the Phoenix streets, Danny exchanged a look with Jake through the rearview mirror. They both knew that this wasn't just talk. This was an escalation, and escalations required responses. That evening, the Phoenix Rising gym was more crowded than it had been in months. Word had spread about the confrontation outside the school, and fighters who hadn't been able to participate in the original escort roster had shown up to offer their support. The warehouse space hummed with anxious energy as Ray called everyone to order. "All right, listen up," the old coach said, his voice cutting through the chatter. "We knew this might happen. We knew these people weren't just going to give up and go away, but we also made a commitment, and I don't think anyone here is interested in backing down." He looked around at the assembled faces. "Am I wrong?" A chorus of no's echoed through the gym. "Good, but we need to be smart about this. These people have resources we don't. They have connections we don't. What we have is numbers and training, but we're not going to win this by fighting them on their terms." Ray paused, gathering his thoughts. "Lisa, what have you found out about Elena's legal situation?" Lisa stepped forward, a folder of papers in her hand. "I've been researching, and I think there might be an avenue here. The loan that Elena was tricked into co-signing, there's a good chance it's not legally enforceable. The terms are predatory, the interest rates are usurious, and if she truly wasn't aware of what she was signing, there's a case for fraud." "What does that mean practically?" Marcus asked. "It means that if we can get a lawyer involved, if we can challenge this debt legally, there's a chance we can make it go away entirely, or at least reduce it to something manageable." Lisa held up one of the papers. "I've been in touch with a legal aid organization that specializes in exactly this kind of case. They're willing to take Elena's situation on pro bono." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. Elena, who had been sitting quietly in the corner with Miguel, looked up with surprise. "I didn't know about this," she said. "You've been doing this without telling me." Lisa smiled. "We wanted to make sure we had something concrete before we got your hopes up. But yes, I've been working on this since the first day. The legal process will take time, but if we can buy you that time, if we can keep these people at bay until the courts can get involved, there's a real chance you can get out from under this." Elena's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Ray said. "This is what communities do. They take care of each other." He turned back to the group. "But in the meantime, we need to be more vigilant. These men who showed up today, they were testing us. They wanted to see if we were serious. We showed them we were. The question is, what's their next move going to be?" The discussion continued late into the evening. Strategies and contingencies mapped out with the same detail they'd apply to preparing for a championship fight. When the meeting finally broke up, close to midnight, no one left alone. The fighters departed in groups, some heading to their homes, others volunteering for overnight shifts near Elena's apartment building. As the gym emptied, Marcus found himself standing near Elena, who was watching Miguel sleep on a stack of workout mats in the corner. The boy had fought to stay awake through the meeting, wanting to be part of whatever was being planned, but exhaustion had eventually won out. "Thank you," Elena said quietly, not taking her eyes off her son, "for everything, for all of this. I came to your gym thinking maybe someone would show me how to throw a punch. I never imagined—" She trailed off, unable to find words adequate to the situation. Marcus leaned against the wall beside her. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you come here? Out of all the places you could have gone for help, why a fighting gym?" Elena was silent for a long moment, considering the question. "When I was a little girl," she finally said, "my father was a boxer. Not professional, just amateur bouts at the local gym in our neighborhood. He never won any championships, never made any money from it, but I remember how I felt when I watched him fight. I remember thinking that my father was the strongest, bravest person in the world, that as long as he was around, nothing bad could ever happen to me." She turned to look at Marcus, and in the dim light of the gym, he could see the tears on her cheeks. "My father died when I was 15. Heart attack, completely unexpected. And ever since then I've felt lost. I felt like there's no one strong enough to protect me, no one brave enough to stand between me and the world." She gestured to the sleeping boy. "When I had Miguel, I told myself I would be that person for him. I would be strong enough and brave enough for both of us. But I'm not. I'm just a tired nurse who made bad choices and married the wrong man." "That's not true," Marcus said. "Isn't it?" Marcus shook his head slowly. "You walked into a gym full of strangers and asked them for help. You put aside your pride and your fear because your son needed you to. That takes more courage than anything I've ever done in a ring." He pushed off from the wall and turned to face her fully. "You came here looking for strength, and you found it. Not from us, from yourself. We're just here to help you remember what you're capable of." Elena stared at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression. Then slowly, she nodded. "My father would have liked you," she said. "I'll take that as a compliment."
"It is."
The next 2 weeks passed with relative calm. The legal process Lisa had initiated was moving forward, with the pro bono lawyers filing preliminary challenges to the debt. The men in the black sedan and silver SUV continued to make occasional appearances, but they kept their distance, watching and waiting. It was a holding pattern, both sides assessing the other, neither willing to make the first move. During this time, something unexpected happened. Miguel began spending more time at the gym. It started innocently enough. With Elena's double shifts at the hospital, finding childcare had always been a challenge. The gym, with its rotating cast of fighters and its location central to Miguel's school route, became a natural solution. At first, the boy just did his homework in the corner, keeping to himself while the adults trained around him, but gradually, inevitably, he was drawn in. It was Danny who first noticed Miguel, watching the training sessions with obvious fascination. The welterweight approached the boy during a water break, dropping down to sit beside him on the bench. "You interested in this stuff?" Danny asked, gesturing to the sparring happening in the ring. Miguel shrugged with practiced nonchalance, but his eyes gave him away. It's okay, I guess. Danny smiled. You know, I was about your age when I first walked into a gym. I was small for my age, got picked on a lot. I thought if I learned how to fight, I could make the bullies leave me alone. Did it work? Yes and no. Danny stretched his arms behind his head. I learned how to fight, sure, but more importantly, I learned something about myself. I learned that being strong isn't about hurting other people. It's about having the confidence to walk away from fights you don't need to have. Miguel considered this. What if you can't walk away? What if the fights keep coming to you? Danny's smile faded slightly. Then you do what you have to do, but you always try to walk away first, and you never, ever start something you're not prepared to finish. From that day on, Miguel became an unofficial junior member of Phoenix Rising. Ray started him on basic exercises and fundamentals, nothing advanced, just enough to help build his confidence and coordination. The boy took to it with natural enthusiasm, soaking up instruction like a sponge, and as his body grew stronger, so did his spirit. The hunched shoulders began to straighten. The eyes that had been fixed on the ground started to lift. The boy, who had been afraid to walk home from school, was slowly transforming into something else. Elena watched these changes with mixed emotions. Part of her worried about her son learning violence, even controlled violence, even defensive violence, but a larger part of her recognized what was really happening. Miguel was finding himself. He was discovering that he wasn't helpless, that there were things he could control in a world that had seemed entirely beyond his power. And he was finding family. That's what Phoenix Rising had become for both of them. The fighters who had stepped up to protect a stranger had become something more than protectors. They were uncles and aunts, big brothers and sisters, a community of support that wrapped around Elena and Miguel like armor. Ray, in particular, had taken a special interest in the boy's development. The old coach, who had never married and had no children of his own, saw something in Miguel that reminded him of himself at that age. An intelligence behind the eyes, a hunger for belonging, a resilience that only needed the right environment to flourish. You know, Ray said one afternoon, watching Miguel practice his stance in front of the gym's cracked mirror, I've been doing this for 40 years. I've trained thousands of fighters, and I can usually tell within the first week who has what it takes and who doesn't. Elena, who had taken to watching Miguel's training sessions whenever her schedule allowed, looked at him curiously. And what do you see in Miguel? Ray smiled. I see a kid who's going to be just fine. Fighting or not fighting, inside a ring or out of it, that boy has something that can't be taught. He has heart, and heart is what matters most in the end. It was during the third week of the escort operation that the break came. Marcus received a call from Officer Hendricks at 7 in the morning, her voice tight with controlled excitement. We got him, she said without preamble. Carlos Vasquez, Elena's ex-husband. He was picked up in a raid last night, part of a federal operation targeting the organization he was connected to. Marcus sat up straighter, the fog of sleep clearing instantly. What does that mean for Elena? It means the whole organization is going down. The people who were after her, the ones claiming she owed money, they're all looking at serious federal charges, racketeering, extortion, fraud, the kind of charges that make debt collection the least of their worries. Hendricks paused. The men who were following Miguel have been identified. They're already in custody. It's over. Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Does Elena know? I'm heading to tell her now. I thought you might want to be there. I'm on my way. By the time Marcus arrived at Elena's apartment building, several other Phoenix Rising fighters were already gathered outside. Word had spread through the group chat with characteristic speed. They clustered on the sidewalk, waiting, their faces showing a mixture of relief and anticipation. When Eleanor opened her door to find Officer Hendricks standing there with Marcus behind her, the panic that flashed across her face was immediate and heartbreaking. She thought it was more bad news. She thought something had happened to someone who had been trying to protect her. But then Hendricks smiled and everything changed. The explanation took nearly an hour. Hendricks laid out the details of the federal investigation, the scope of the arrests, the evidence that had been gathered against the organization that had been terrorizing Elena and Miguel. She explained that while the legal challenges to the debt would still proceed, the practical threat had been eliminated. The people who had been after them were going to prison. They wouldn't be following anyone home from school for a very long time. Elena listened in silence, her hand gripping Miguel's with whitening knuckles. When Hendricks finally finished, when the full weight of what she was saying had sunk in, Elena did something no one expected. She laughed. It started small, a hiccup of disbelief that bubbled up from her chest, but it grew, expanding into a full-bodied expression of release that brought tears streaming down her face. She laughed until she couldn't breathe, until she had to sit down on her worn couch, until Miguel was looking at her with genuine concern. "Mom," the boy said, "are you okay?" Elena pulled him into a hug, her laughter transforming into sobs, the kind of cathartic release that comes when pressure held for too long is finally allowed to escape. "I'm okay," she managed. "I'm so okay. We're okay." The fighters who had crowded into the small apartment watched this scene with varying degrees of emotion. Jake Morrison, the giant heavyweight who had knocked out 17 opponents, was openly wiping tears from his eyes. Danny Chen stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight with the effort of maintaining composure. Lisa Park had given up on composure entirely, her own tears flowing freely as she watched mother and son cling to each other. Marcus stood apart from the group, leaning against the doorframe of the kitchen. He watched Elena and Miguel, watched the way they held each other with desperate gratitude, and felt something shift in his own chest. This was why he had started fighting, not for the glory or the money or the competition. This right here, this moment of human connection and protection and love. This was what strength was for. Ray had arrived during Hendricks' explanation, and now the old coach moved to stand beside Marcus. "Feeling good?" he asked quietly. Marcus nodded. "Feeling like we did something that mattered." "That's because we did." Ray watched Elena finally release Miguel from the hug, watched her turn to face the assembled fighters with an expression of overwhelming gratitude. "This is what I've been trying to build at Phoenix Rising for 20 years. Not just fighters, a community, a family, people who look out for each other." He glanced at Marcus. "I think we've finally got there." When Elena finally managed to compose herself, she stood on shaky legs and faced the room full of people who had changed her life. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice hoarse from crying. "I came to your gym as a stranger, desperate and afraid, and you, all of you, became my family. You protected my son when I couldn't. You gave me hope when I had none." She paused, struggling to find words. "I will never be able to repay what you've done for us." "That's not how family works," Jake said gently. "We don't keep score. We just show up for each other." Danny stepped forward. "Besides, you've already given us something in return. You gave us purpose. You reminded us why we train, why we fight." He gestured to Miguel. "And you gave us this little champion here, who's going to be kicking our butts in the ring in a few years." Laughter rippled through the room, and even Miguel managed a shy smile at the attention. "There is one thing," Ray said, moving toward Elena. "Something you could do for us if you're willing." Elena nodded immediately. "Anything." "Keep coming to the gym, both of you. Not because you need protection anymore, but because you're part of us now." The old coach's weathered face softened into something approaching sentimentality. "Phoenix Rising is about more than training. It's about community. It's about showing up for each other, not just in crisis, but every day. We'd be honored to have you as members of our family." Elena looked around at the faces surrounding her, these people who had been strangers just weeks ago, who had asked for nothing in return for their help, who had put themselves between her child and danger simply because it was the right thing to do. She thought about her father, about the boxing gym of her childhood, about the feeling of safety and belonging she had lost when he died. "I would be honored to be part of your family," she said. The celebration that followed was impromptu but enthusiastic. Someone ran out for pizza, someone else for drinks, the small apartment filled with noise and laughter, with stories and jokes, with the particular energy that comes from a group of people who have faced danger together and come out the other side. Miguel sat in the center of it all, surrounded by the fighters who had become his protectors and friends. Jake was teaching him a simple arm triangle, their size difference comical but somehow endearing. Danny was demonstrating footwork patterns in the limited space available. Lisa was explaining the history of women in mixed martial arts to an increasingly fascinated audience of both Miguel and Elena. Marcus watched from his position near the window, a slice of pizza in one hand and a quiet contentment in his heart. Officer Hendricks had left an hour ago, satisfied that her message had been delivered and that the situation was well in hand. What remained was simply people enjoying each other's company, celebrating not just a victory, but a connection that would last far longer than any threat. Ray appeared beside him again, a habit the old coach seemed to have developed. "Thinking deep thoughts?" he asked. "Thinking about next steps," Marcus admitted. "This worked. What we did here, it worked. It makes me wonder what else we could do." "You mean taking on other cases like this? Other people who need protection?" Marcus nodded slowly. "There are a lot of Elenas out there, a lot of Miguels, people who fall through the cracks who don't have anyone to stand up for them." He gestured to the room full of fighters. "And there are a lot of us with skills that could help." Ray was quiet for a long moment, considering this. "It would have to be organized properly," he finally said. "Legal oversight, clear guidelines, cooperation with law enforcement. We couldn't just be vigilantes." "I know, but there's got to be a way." "There might be." Ray's eyes had taken on a distant look, the look of a man seeing possibilities he hadn't considered before. "Let me make some calls. I know people, organizations that work on this kind of thing. If there's a path forward, we'll find it." As the afternoon turned to evening and the celebration finally wound down, Eleanor stood at her window watching the fighters depart. They left in groups, hugging her and Miguel goodbye, promising to see them at the gym soon. One by one, they disappeared into the Phoenix streets until only the memory of their presence remained. Miguel appeared at her side, leaning against her in the way he'd done when he was much younger. "Mom?" "Yes, mijo?" "I'm not scared anymore." Elena put her arm around her son's shoulders, pulling him close. "Neither am I." "Does that mean we're strong now?" Elena considered the question, thinking about everything that had happened over the past month, the fear and the desperation, the strangers who had become family, the courage she had found in herself that she hadn't known existed, the transformation she had witnessed in her son from a frightened child to someone who was beginning to understand his own worth. "I think we've always been strong," she finally said. "We just needed help remembering." They stood there together as the Arizona sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. Somewhere in the distance, a dog was barking. A car passed by with music playing, something upbeat and hopeful. The neighborhood sounds that had once seemed threatening now felt simply like life, ordinary and beautiful and full of possibility. Tomorrow, Elena would go back to her shifts at the hospital. Tomorrow, Miguel would go back to school. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own fears, its own uncertainties. But tomorrow would also bring the knowledge that they were not alone. that somewhere across the city, in a converted warehouse in the industrial district, there were people who cared about them. People who would show up when needed. People who had proven, through action rather than words, what community really meant. That night, for the first time in months, Elena slept without nightmares, and in the room next door, Miguel slept with a smile on his face, dreaming of the ring at Phoenix Rising, of the fighters who had become his family, of the person he was learning to become. In the months that followed, the transformation of both Elena and Miguel continued at a pace that surprised even those who had witnessed its beginning. Elena, who had spent years surviving in isolation, gradually opened herself to the community that had embraced her. She started attending the gym not just to watch Miguel train, but to participate herself. Ray set her up with Lisa Park for private lessons, and though Elena would never be a competitive fighter, she found something in the practice that she hadn't known she needed. The discipline, the focus, the feeling of her body growing stronger and more capable. It was healing in ways she couldn't articulate. Her work at the hospital took on new meaning as well. Inspired by what the Phoenix Rising community had done for her, Elena began paying attention to patients who seemed isolated, who seemed to be facing their challenges alone. She started connecting them with resources, with support groups, with community organizations that could help. It was small gestures, recommendations and referrals, but they added up. And every time she saw relief in a patient's eyes, she thought of the moment she had walked into that gym, desperate and alone, and found help she never expected. The legal proceedings against the debt collectors moved forward, as Lisa had predicted. The pro bono lawyers proved their worth, dismantling the fraudulent loan document by document, testimony by testimony. When the final judgment came down, declaring the debt null and void due to fraud and predatory practices, Elena wept in the courtroom. But these were different tears than those she had shed before. These were tears of relief, of closure, of a chapter finally and definitively ending. Miguel's progress was perhaps even more dramatic. Under Ray's careful guidance, he developed into a genuinely talented young fighter. More than that, he developed into a confident young man. The hunched shoulders and downcast eyes were gone, replaced by a posture that spoke of self-assurance and belonging. His grades improved. He made friends at school. The nightmares that had plagued him for so long faded until they became distant memories. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in how Miguel related to others who were struggling. The boy who had once been a victim of intimidation became an advocate for those facing similar circumstances. When a classmate confided that he was being bullied, Miguel didn't just offer sympathy. He brought the boy to Phoenix Rising, introduced him to Ray, and watched as the same transformation he had experienced began to unfold in someone else. "That's how it spreads," Ray told Marcus one afternoon, watching Miguel lead his friend through basic drills. Not through force, but through example, through community, through showing people that they don't have to face their challenges alone. Marcus nodded, thinking about the initiative they had been developing since Elena's crisis. True to his word, Ray had made calls, connected with organizations, explored possibilities. What had emerged was a formal program, a way for fighters from Phoenix Rising to volunteer their skills in service of people who needed protection. It was organized properly, with legal oversight and clear guidelines, everything they had discussed. But more than that, it was effective. In its first year of operation, the Phoenix Rising Community Protection Initiative had helped dozens of families facing intimidation, harassment, or threats they couldn't handle alone. The program had attracted attention beyond Phoenix. Other gyms, other communities had reached out asking how they could replicate the model. Marcus found himself traveling to speak at conferences, to consult with organizations, to share the story of how 20 fighters, following a single mom home, had sparked a movement. But through all of it, through the growth and the recognition and the expansion, Marcus never lost sight of what mattered most. It wasn't the programs or the initiatives or the public recognition. It was the individual moments, the look on a child's face when they realized they were safe, the tears of relief from a parent who had thought they were alone, the slow transformation of fear into confidence, of isolation into community. On the 1-year anniversary of the day Elena had walked into Phoenix Rising, the gym hosted a special event. It was part celebration, part reunion, part introduction for newcomers who had joined the community in the month since. The warehouse space was decorated with streamers and balloons, a strange contrast to the heavy bags and workout equipment that surrounded them. Food tables lined one wall, and music played from speakers someone had set up in the corner. Elena stood at the center of the celebration, no longer the desperate woman who had burst through those doors a year ago. She had filled out, her frame no longer gaunt from exhaustion and stress. Her eyes had lost their haunted quality, replaced by a warmth that drew people to her. She was laughing at something Danny had said, her hand resting naturally on Miguel's shoulder as the boy stood beside her. Miguel had grown several inches in the past year. At 13, he was showing the first hints of the man he would become, his childish features giving way to something more defined. He wore a Phoenix Rising t-shirt that had been his first, now too small but too precious to discard. Around his neck hung a medal he had won at his first junior competition, a bronze finish that he treasured more than gold. Ray called for attention, and the room gradually quieted. The old coach stood on a small platform that had been set up for speeches, looking out at the assembled crowd. Behind him hung a banner that read, "Phoenix Rising Community Protection Initiative, 1 year strong." "A year ago," Ray began, his voice carrying through the space, "a woman walked into this gym asking for help. She didn't know us. We didn't know her, but she took a chance, and we answered." He paused, letting the words settle. What happened next changed all of us. It reminded us why we train. It showed us what community really means. And it proved that ordinary people working together can accomplish extraordinary things. He gestured to Elena and Miguel. Elena Vasquez and her son Miguel didn't just find protection here, they found family, and in doing so, they helped create something that has now helped hundreds of other families find the same. Ray's voice thickened with emotion. "A year ago, I thought I knew what Phoenix Rising was. A gym, a training facility, a place where fighters came to hone their skills." He shook his head. "I was wrong. Phoenix Rising is so much more than that. It's a community. It's a family. It's proof that we are stronger together than we could ever be alone." The applause that followed was thunderous. Elena wiped tears from her eyes, overcome by the moment. Miguel stood tall beside her, no longer the frightened boy who had walked home in fear, but a young man who had found his place in the world. When Ray invited Elena to say a few words, she hesitated for only a moment before climbing onto the platform. She looked out at the faces before her, so many of them now familiar, so many of them now dear. She thought about what she wanted to say, about how to capture the enormity of what this community had given her. "1 year ago," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it, "I was alone. I was scared. I was a single mother watching my son being terrorized, and I didn't know where to turn." She paused, composing herself. "I walked into this gym as a last resort. I didn't expect anyone to help. I had learned, through years of hard experience, that people don't just help strangers. That the world is every person for themselves." Her eyes found Marcus in the crowd, then Jake, then Danny and Lisa and all the others who had stood up for her when they had no reason to. "You proved me wrong," she said simply. "All of you. You showed me that there are still good people in this world. people who will stand up for what's right, people who will protect a child they've never met simply because he needed protecting. Elena's voice strengthened as she continued, "But you gave me something even more important than protection. You gave me hope. You showed me that I wasn't alone. You reminded me that community still exists, that family isn't just about blood, that there are people in this world who will show up when you need them most." She reached down and pulled Miguel up onto the platform beside her. "My son is a different person now. He stands taller, he sleeps better, he laughs more. And it's because of all of you, because you showed him what it means to be part of something bigger than yourself, because you taught him that strength isn't about hurting people, it's about protecting them." The room was silent, hanging on her every word. "I can never repay what you've done for us," Eleanor concluded, "but I can promise you this. Miguel and I will spend the rest of our lives paying it forward. We will be the community for others that you have been for us. We will show up when people need us. We will stand up when others can't stand for themselves." She smiled through her tears. "That's your legacy. That's what Phoenix Rising has created. Not just fighters, not just a gym, a movement of people who refuse to let others face their battles alone." The applause that followed was even louder than before. Elena was enveloped in hugs, in congratulations, in the warm embrace of a community that had truly become her family. Miguel stood beside her, accepting high fives and pats on the back from fighters who had once seemed like giants and now seemed like brothers. As the celebration continued around them, Marcus stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The Arizona night was warm, the stars barely visible through the light pollution of the city. He leaned against the wall of the gym, listening to the sounds of joy filtering through the door, thinking about everything that had happened since that afternoon when a desperate woman had interrupted their training. Ray joined him a few minutes later, 2 bottles of water in hand. He offered one to Marcus, who accepted with a nod of thanks. "Hell of a year," Ray said. "Hell of a year," Marcus agreed. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, 2 men who had seen more than most, who had learned that the real fights weren't always in the ring. "You know," Ray said eventually, "when I started this gym 40 years ago, I thought I was building a place where fighters could train. That was it. Simple, straightforward." He shook his head slowly. "I had no idea what it would become. I had no idea what we could accomplish when we stopped thinking about ourselves and started thinking about others." Marcus nodded. "The funny thing is, it made us better fighters too. All of us. Having something to fight for beyond just winning, it changes things." "It does." Ray took a long drink of water. "So what's next for you?" Marcus had been thinking about that question for a while. The answer had been forming slowly, taking shape over the months of the initiative's growth. "I want to take this further," he said. "The community protection work. I want to make it my main focus. Not just helping here in Phoenix, but building a model that other communities can follow." Ray smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that, because I've been getting calls, lots of calls, people who want to start their own programs, people who want to learn from what we've done." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "There's an organization, National Scope, that's interested in partnering with us. They have resources, connections, the kind of infrastructure we could never build on our own." Marcus took the card, examining it in the dim light. "You've been planning this." "I've been hoping for this. There's a difference." Ray turned to look at him directly. "You've got a gift, Marcus. Not just for fighting, but for leading, for inspiring people. What you did for Elena and Miguel, the way you brought everyone together, that's rare, and it shouldn't be confined to one gym in one city." The door opened behind them, spilling light and noise into the night. Elena appeared, looking for them. "There you are. They're about to cut the cake. Miguel insisted you both had to be there." Marcus pocketed the business card and pushed off from the wall. "Wouldn't miss it." As they walked back inside, back into the warmth and celebration of the community they had built, Marcus felt something settle in his chest. A sense of purpose, a sense of direction. For years, he had been searching for meaning beyond the ring, beyond the competitions and the victories and the defeats. He had found it in the most unexpected way, in a desperate woman asking strangers for help, in a scared boy who needed protection, in the simple act of showing up for someone who had no one else. The cake was chocolate, Miguel's favorite, with 1 year stronger written in blue frosting. As they gathered around to watch the boy blow out the candles, Marcus looked at the faces illuminated by the flickering light. Elena, radiant with joy. Ray, proud as any grandfather. Jake and Danny and Lisa and all the others who had become family, not through blood but through choice. This was what strength looked like, not muscles or technique or victories in competition. This, people choosing to stand together, people refusing to let others face their battles alone, people building something bigger than themselves. Miguel blew out the candles to cheers and applause. As the lights came back on and the cake was cut and distributed, he made his way over to Marcus, a plate in each hand. "One for you," he said, offering the larger piece. "Coach Ray says you're thinking about taking this program national." Marcus accepted the cake with a smile. "Thinking about it, yeah." Miguel nodded seriously, with all the gravity a 13-year-old could muster. "Good. Because there are a lot of kids out there like me, kids who are scared, kids who don't have anyone to help them." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "They deserve what I got. They deserve a phoenix rising." Marcus looked at the boy, at the confident young man he was becoming, and felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with fighting. "You're right," he said. "They do."
So you'll do it?
"I'll do it." Miguel's face broke into a grin. "Good, because I'm going to help when I'm older, when I'm trained enough. I'm going to be one of the people who shows up for others." He stood straighter, squaring his shoulders in a way that echoed the fighters who had protected him. "That's my plan." Marcus put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "That's a good plan." Later that night, after the celebration had wound down and the gym had emptied, Marcus sat alone in the darkened space. The decorations had been taken down, the food tables cleared, the chairs stacked against the wall. Only the moonlight filtering through the high windows illuminated the room, casting long shadows across the mats where so much had changed. He thought about Elena's words, about paying it forward, about being the community for others that Phoenix Rising had been for her. He thought about Miguel's determination, about the boy's plan to become someone who shows up for others. He thought about Ray's offer, about the business card in his pocket, about the possibility of taking what they had built and spreading it across the country. And he thought about himself, about the man he had been when Elena walked through that door and the man he had become in the year since. He had spent his whole life fighting for victories that disappeared the moment they were won. Now he had something else, something lasting, something that mattered. Tomorrow he would make the call. Tomorrow he would begin the next chapter. Tomorrow the work of building something bigger would start in earnest. But tonight he simply sat in the darkness and let himself feel grateful. Grateful for the desperate woman who had trusted strangers with her son's safety. Grateful for the 20 fighters who had followed her home. Grateful for the community that had emerged from that simple act of kindness. Grateful for the reminder that strength, real strength, was never about what you could do for yourself. It was always about what you could do for others. The phoenix rises, not alone but together, not from ashes but from community, not for glory but for something far more precious. For family. 2 years after Elena Vasquez first walked into Phoenix Rising, the gym had transformed into something Ray Delgado couldn't have imagined when he opened its doors 4 decades earlier. The physical space was largely unchanged. The same worn mats and heavy bags, the same octagon ring at the center, the same wheezing air conditioning unit fighting the Arizona heat. But the atmosphere was different. The walls were now covered not just with photos of fighters, but with newspaper clippings about the Community Protection Initiative, with thank you letters from families they had helped, with a growing map showing partner organizations across the country. Marcus had made the call, taken the meeting, and launched what would become the Phoenix Rising Network. Within 6 months, there were chapters in 12 cities. Within a year, 32. Each one was built on the same principles that had guided that first spontaneous operation: visible protection, legal coordination, community support, and absolute commitment to non-violent intervention. Fighters and martial artists across the country answered the call, eager for the chance to use their skills for something beyond competition. But the growth brought challenges. Resources were stretched thin, coordination became complicated, and perhaps most difficult, success brought expectations. Families in crisis learned about Phoenix Rising and reached out for help, sometimes faster than the organization could respond. The weight of those expectations was heavy, and Marcus felt it acutely. It was during one of those overwhelmed moments that Eleanor found him. She had become a permanent fixture at the gym, no longer a recipient of help, but a provider of it. Her nursing background had proven invaluable in the initiative's medical response team, and her personal story had become a powerful tool for outreach and fundraising. She was, in many ways, the heart of what Phoenix Rising had become. "You're brooding," she said, settling onto the bench beside him. Marcus managed a tired smile. "That obvious?" "To me, yes." She handed him a cup of coffee, steam rising in the cool morning air of the gym. "What's weighing on you?" "We got 4 new requests yesterday, families who need help, and we don't have the capacity to help all of them." He ran his hand over his face. "How do you choose? How do you decide who gets protection and who doesn't?" Elena was quiet for a moment. "You can't save everyone," she finally said. "I learned that in the hospital long before I learned it here. Sometimes patients die. Sometimes you do everything right, and it still doesn't work. And you have to find a way to keep going, to help the next person, without drowning in guilt over the ones you couldn't save." "That's easy to say." "It's not easy at all. It's the hardest thing in the world." She turned to face him. "But here's what I've learned. Every family you help, every child you protect, creates ripples. They go on to help others, just like we talked about. The impact spreads far beyond what you can see or measure." She gestured around the gym. 2 years ago, you helped 1 mother and 1 child. Look what grew from that." Marcus followed her gesture, taking in the bustling gym. Fighters were training, volunteers were organizing. The administrative team Lisa now led was processing requests and coordinating responses. It was a far cry from that afternoon when 20 fighters had spontaneously volunteered to walk a scared boy home from school. "I just wish we could do more," he said. "That feeling never goes away," Eleanor replied. "And it shouldn't. That's what keeps us pushing, keeps us growing, keeps us looking for new ways to help." She smiled. "Besides, you've got reinforcements coming." As if on cue, the gym door opened and Miguel walked in. At 15, he was nearly as tall as Marcus now, with the lean build of a natural athlete and a presence that commanded attention despite his youth. He had won his age division at the state championships last year, but more importantly, he had become a peer mentor in the organization's youth program, working with kids who were facing situations similar to what he had experienced. But he wasn't alone. Behind him came a group of about a dozen teenagers, all wearing Phoenix Rising t-shirts, all with the same mix of nervousness and determination that Miguel had shown on his first day. The new junior volunteer class, Miguel explained, leading the group toward Marcus and Elena, ready for orientation. Marcus stood, feeling some of his weariness lift. These kids were the future, the next generation of protectors, of community builders, of people who would show up when others needed them most. Some of them, he knew, had been helped by Phoenix Rising in the past. They were here now to pay it forward. "Welcome," he said, addressing the group. "I'm Marcus Thompson, and I want to tell you a story." He began with Elena, with a desperate woman bursting through the gym doors on a Tuesday afternoon, with 20 fighters who followed her home without being asked, with a scared 12-year-old boy who learned that he wasn't alone. The teenagers listened with rapt attention, especially when Miguel took over part of the narrative, sharing his own experience from his perspective. He spoke about the fear he had felt, the transformation he had undergone, the person he had become. "Phoenix Rising isn't about fighting," Miguel concluded. "It's about protection. It's about community. It's about showing people that they don't have to face their battles alone." He looked at each of the new volunteers in turn. "That's what you're here to learn. That's what you're here to become." The orientation continued through the morning, with different team members sharing their experiences and expertise. Lisa covered legal guidelines and coordination with authorities. Jake demonstrated the art of presence without confrontation. Danny led an exercise in de-escalation techniques. Ray shared wisdom accumulated over 40 years of building community through martial arts. Elena watched it all unfold, feeling a complicated mix of pride and wonder. This was her legacy too. Not just Miguel's transformation, not just her own recovery, but this, an organization that had grown from her moment of desperate courage, a community that had emerged from the simple act of asking for help. When the orientation broke for lunch, she found herself standing at the window, looking out at the Phoenix Street where she had parked her car on that pivotal day 2 years ago. The neighborhood hadn't changed much. The buildings were the same, the streets the same, the relentless Arizona sun the same, but she had changed. Everything had changed. Marcus appeared at her side. "Penny, for your thoughts?" "Just thinking about the day I walked in here," she said. "I was so scared, so desperate. I didn't know what I was going to find." "What did you find?" Elena smiled. "Everything. I found everything." She turned to look at the room full of people behind them, and it's still growing, still becoming something more. Marcus nodded. "That's the thing about community. It doesn't have an end point. It doesn't reach a final form and stop. It just keeps evolving, keeps expanding, keeps finding new ways to help and new people to include." "Is that exhausting?" "Sometimes, but mostly it's inspiring." He paused, considering his next words. "You know, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about how every family we help creates ripples. And I've been looking at the data, tracking what happens to the families after we help them, where they end up, what they do, how their lives unfold." Marcus's eyes grew brighter. "Elena, over 60% of them become volunteers themselves. They come back to help others, just like you did, just like Miguel is doing." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. "Really?" "Really. And that's not counting the indirect impact. The people they help who then help others, the communities they build, the ripples of the ripples." Marcus shook his head in wonder. "We thought we were helping individuals. Turns out we were starting something much bigger." That afternoon, the gym hosted its quarterly family event, a gathering that brought together current clients, past recipients of help, volunteers and supporters. The warehouse space was transformed with tables and chairs, with food and decorations, with the warm chaos of a community celebration. Elena moved through the crowd, greeting familiar faces and meeting new ones. There was the Rodriguez family, whose daughter had been protected from an abusive ex-boyfriend. There was the Chen family, whose son had been freed from a situation of bullying so severe it had made him afraid to attend school. There was the Williams family, the Nguyens, the Johnsons, each with their own story of crisis and rescue, of fear and relief. And there were the volunteers, the fighters who gave their time and skills, the lawyers who provided legal guidance, the counselors who offered emotional support, the administrators who kept everything running smoothly, a community built from countless individual acts of compassion and courage. Miguel was at the center of a group of teenagers, leading them in some kind of game that involved a lot of laughter and mock martial arts poses. He looked so happy, Elena thought, so completely at home. The scared boy who couldn't sleep was now a leader, an inspiration, a living testament to what community could accomplish. Ray appeared beside her, a plate of food in his hand. "You should eat something," he said, offering her a portion. Elena accepted with a grateful smile. "Thank you for everything, not just the food." Ray waved off the gratitude. "I should be thanking you. Before you walked through that door, I was running a gym. Now I'm running a movement." He watched the crowd with evident pride. "This is what I always hoped Phoenix Rising could be. I just didn't know how to get there." "You got there by being open," Elena said. "By saying yes when a stranger asked for help, by letting your fighters follow their instincts to protect." "Maybe, but it was your courage that started it, walking into a gym full of fighters, interrupting their training, demanding that they listen to you." Ray shook his head. "That took more guts than most professional fighters have." "I didn't feel brave, I felt desperate." "That's often the same thing," Ray replied. "The bravest acts usually come from people who don't have any other choice, who have been pushed so far that they have to stand up even when they're terrified, even when they don't know if it will work." He looked at her directly. "You taught these fighters something that day. You showed them what real courage looks like, and it changed all of them." Elena thought about that as the afternoon wore on, as the celebration continued around her. She thought about courage and desperation, about community and family, about the strange path that had led her from California to Phoenix, from isolation to belonging. She thought about her father, the amateur boxer who had never won any championships but had made his daughter feel safe. She thought about how his death had left her adrift, searching for that feeling of protection he had provided. She thought about how she had finally found it, not in a single person, but in a community. And she thought about the future, about the continued growth of the organization, about Miguel's plans to become a professional protector, a full-time defender of those who couldn't defend themselves, about the teenagers who had arrived that morning, eager to begin their own journeys of service. The future was uncertain, as it always was. There would be challenges, setbacks, moments of doubt, but there would also be this: community, connection, the knowledge that no one had to face their battles alone. As the sun set over Phoenix, casting the gym in golden light, Elena found Marcus again. He was standing near the door, watching the crowd with an expression of quiet contentment. "Good day," she said.
One of the best.
They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who had found unexpected purpose in each other's lives. "Thank you," Elena finally said, "for that first day, for not turning me away, for believing that what I was asking was possible." Marcus shook his head. "Thank you for walking through that door, for taking a chance on us, for showing us what we were capable of." He turned to face her. "You know, I've trained my whole life to be strong, to win fights, to overcome opponents, to prove myself in the ring, but I never understood what strength really was until I met you." "What do you mean?" "Real strength isn't about what you can do to others. It's about what you can do for others. It's about standing up when you're terrified, asking for help when you've been taught to be self-sufficient, trusting strangers when the world has given you every reason not to trust." Marcus gestured to the room full of people. "You taught us that." You showed us that the strongest thing a person can do is reach out their hand and ask for help. And in doing so, you created all of this. Elena felt tears threaten again, but she held them back. I just asked for help. You're the ones who answered. And we'll keep answering, for as long as there are people who need us. Marcus smiled. That's the promise of Phoenix Rising. That's the legacy you started. Across the room, Miguel looked up from his game with the other teenagers. He caught his mother's eye and waved, his face bright with joy. Elena waved back, her heart full. This was her family now. Not just Miguel, but all of them. The fighters who had followed her home. The community that had grown from that first act of kindness. The movement that was spreading across the country, reaching families she would never meet, protecting children she would never know. This was what strength looked like. This was what community meant. This was the power of people choosing to stand together, to show up for each other, to refuse to let anyone face their battles alone. The phoenix had risen, and it would keep rising higher and further as long as there were people willing to carry it forward. As long as there were people willing to answer when someone asked for help. As long as there were people willing to follow a single mom home simply because she needed them to. In the years that followed, the Phoenix Rising Network continued to grow, eventually establishing chapters in all 50 states and several countries abroad. Marcus became a recognized leader in the community protection movement, speaking at conferences and consulting with organizations around the world, but he never forgot where it started. He never forgot the Tuesday afternoon when a desperate woman interrupted training and changed everything. Ray Delgado retired at 70, handing over ownership of the original gym to a collective of longtime fighters who had been with him from the beginning. But he remained a fixture at Phoenix Rising, showing up most days to watch training, to offer advice, to tell stories of the old days to anyone who would listen. When he passed away at 78, the gym was renamed in his honor. The Ray Delgado Community Center continued the work he had started, training fighters and building community for generations to come. Elena Vasquez never stopped paying it forward. She eventually became the director of the Phoenix Rising Medical Response Team, coordinating healthcare support for families in crisis across the network. Her nursing skills saved lives, but more importantly, her story saved spirits. She traveled frequently to speak at events, sharing her journey from desperate single mother to community leader, inspiring others to believe that change was possible. Miguel fulfilled his promise to become a professional protector. He earned his professional fighting record while simultaneously completing a degree in social work, combining the skills of the ring with the knowledge of the classroom. By his mid-20s, he was leading his own chapter of the Phoenix Rising Network in Los Angeles, returning to the city his family had fled to help others who were facing the same dangers they had once faced. But perhaps the most significant legacy of that first operation couldn't be measured in chapters or statistics or individual success stories. It was something more fundamental, more universal, more powerful. It was proof that communities could come together when individuals needed help, proof that strangers could become family through shared purpose, proof that strength wasn't about domination, but about protection, proof that the world, for all its dangers and difficulties, still contained goodness worth believing in. Every time someone walked into a Phoenix Rising chapter, every time a family received help they desperately needed, every time a child walked home safely because someone cared enough to watch over them, that proof was renewed. And it all started with 20 fighters who followed a single mom home. Because they saw why she was asking. Because they understood what she needed. Because they chose to answer. That choice, repeated thousands of times by thousands of people across the country and around the world, became something extraordinary. It became a movement. It became a family. It became Phoenix Rising.